Some sounds can wake the dead part of your soul. He wasn't supposed to come home early, but that day, something drew him back. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for years. Since the fire. Since the loss. Since the night, his whole world changed. And then, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a house like his. Joy. At first, he thought he was dreaming. But when he followed it upstairs, what he found behind that door would break every rule he'd built to protect his heart. And one single word spoken softly, joyfully, would shake the ground beneath him. He thought God had gone silent. But maybe God had just been waiting for the right moment to speak through a child's laughter. James Oliver didn't come home for peace. There hadn't been peace in this house for 5 years. Not since the night the flames took everything he loved. His wife, their unborn child, gone. But by some miracle, the twins had survived. Born too early. Raised in silence. Raised by a man too broken to speak. He kept the house spotless. Every surface polished. Every rule in place. Because if things stayed clean, maybe the memories wouldn't haunt him. He hired help. Quiet, professional, distant. No one who stayed long. No one who mattered. Then came Susan. Soft-spoken, ordinary. She didn't look like a miracle. She didn't act like one either. He barely noticed her. Until today. The meeting had ended early, and something he still doesn't know what told him to go home. When he stepped through the door, the house felt the same. Still, cold, lonely. But then, he heard it. Laughter. Not from a screen, not from a memory. Real laughter. High, wild, alive. He froze. Then he climbed the stairs slowly, like a man approaching something holy or something dangerous. He didn't call their names. He didn't speak. He followed the sound. And when he opened the bedroom door, what he saw was impossible. Before we go on, if you've ever lost something you thought you'd never get back, if you've ever felt like God went quiet, if you've ever prayed for healing but stopped believing it could come, then stay. Click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. I pray this story reminds you that God still moves, even through the smallest voices. And sometimes, the miracle is already in your house. He wasn't looking for anything when he walked in. No one was expecting him. Not the house, not the boys, not Susan. James stepped through the front door the same way he always did. Quiet, alone, carrying more weight than anything in his hands. The air inside was still. It always was. Just walls, furniture, and the ache of what used to be. He didn't hang up his coat, didn't stop to check his phone. He just stood there, keys in one hand, still in his dress shoes, and tried to remember why he came home early in the first place. There was no real reason, just a feeling, and then he heard something. Soft at first, then louder. Laughter. Not canned from a show. Not the polite kind you fake at dinner. It was real. Joyful. Unfiltered. James frowned. The boys weren't usually this loud. They hadn't been. Not in years. He stepped farther in, slow and careful, as if joy was something fragile that might run if he moved too fast. He called out once. No answer. The sound came again above him. He followed it. Not rushing, not afraid. Just drawn by something he didn't understand. And when he reached the door to his bedroom, the sound was right there, like it was waiting for him. He opened it, and time stopped. There, on the bed, was Susan, the housekeeper, jumping, barefoot, her hands holding his sons Owen and Spencer, one on each side. All three of them bouncing, laughing, faces open wide with something he hadn't seen in years. Life. The bed shook beneath them. The same bed he hadn't touched since Eleanor passed. The bed he couldn't even look at most days. Now, it was alive. Filled with movement, noise, and something that looked like light. James stood in the doorway, frozen. He didn't shout, didn't scold, He just watched, stunned. His heart pounded in his ears. Not from anger, from something he didn't have a name for. Then, in the middle of it all, Spencer turned toward Susan. His hair stuck to his forehead, cheeks glowing red from all the jumping. He looked up at her and smiled, wide, honest, full. And then he said it. One word, one name. Mummy. The room fell silent. The jumping stopped. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. James felt something slam through his chest. Not a punch, but the cracking of something deep that had been locked away. Susan's hands gently lowered. She didn't speak. She didn't try to explain. Spencer didn't laugh like it was a joke. He meant it. And James couldn't move. He hadn't heard that word since the hospital, since the fire, since the day Eleanor's body couldn't hold on, but her womb had. She'd held on just long enough to bring the twins into the world. And then she was gone. 2 cries in the nursery. 1 still room in the ICU. That was 5 years ago. And in all that time, the boys had never called anyone Mummy again. Until now. Until this woman. This stranger who folded laundry, mopped floors, and kept her head down. Stepped onto a bed and did something. No therapist, no nanny, no specialist ever could. She reached them. Somehow, she made them feel something they thought they'd lost. And James, he didn't know if he was angry, or grateful, or broken, or saved. He didn't speak. Not a word. Susan looked at him. Her face was soft, still. She didn't look guilty. She looked sad. Like she understood the weight of the word. Like she knew it wasn't hers to carry, but carried it anyway for the boys. Owen, still holding her hand, whispered, "Again?" Susan didn't answer. She was waiting for James. But he didn't give her anything. No nod, no order, no blessing. He just stood there, watching the only 2 people who mattered to him cling to a woman they had known for less than 2 months, and call her the name he thought was buried. His throat burned. His eyes stung, but he held it all back. He turned slowly, left the door open behind him, and walked back down the stairs, as quietly as he had come in. He didn't understand what had just happened. He only knew that something sacred had broken open, and he wasn't ready to look inside. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. James lay on the edge of the bed, the same bed where it happened, his eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The sheets still smelled like them. His sons. Her. There was no scent of perfume, no trace of anything fake. Just warmth. Like something had been lived in, for the first time in a long time. He turned to look at the ceiling, but all he could see was the moment. Spencer's face. That word. Mummy. He had buried that name. Not in anger, not in denial, just in pain. He told himself the boys were too young to remember. But maybe they hadn't forgotten. Maybe they had just been waiting to feel safe again. And somehow, Susan had given them that. He didn't know how, or why, or what to do with it. So, he did what he always did when he didn't have answers. He watched. The next morning, he left his briefcase untouched. He moved through the house slowly, quietly, like someone walking through someone else's home, and maybe he was. He found himself standing by the kitchen doorway, watching through the small space where the wall didn't quite meet the frame. There she was, Susan, tying Owen's shoes. She spoke softly as she worked. Loop, swoop, pull. Got it? Owen nodded like it was a secret code. Spencer giggled as syrup dripped off his pancake and onto the table. Susan smiled and grabbed a napkin. She wiped Spencer's mouth gently, then ran a hand through his hair, messy and wild from sleep. James just stood there, watching, and something inside him pulled tight. She didn't notice him, or maybe she did, and said nothing. That was her way. She never forced her presence, never overstepped. She just filled the space, quietly, carefully, like someone rearranging grief without touching it. Later, he passed by the laundry room. The door was cracked open. Inside, she was humming. Soft. Off-key. But it was the same tune Eleanor used to hum when folding clothes. A tune that had no words, just comfort. James stepped back before she could see him. He told himself he was keeping an eye on things. For the boys. For order. But the truth was simpler. And more complicated. He didn't know who she was. Not really. Susan Harris. 30 years old. No formal training in childcare. No fancy degrees. Just a calm presence and a way of seeing people. Especially his sons. She looked at them like they weren't broken. Like they were boys, not burdens. That afternoon, James walked past the living room and caught sight of something on the wall. A drawing. Crayon on white paper, sloppy, uneven lines. 3 stick figures holding hands. 2 small ones. One taller, one in the middle. And above it, in Spencer's shaky handwriting, me, Owen, and Miss Susan. Not housekeeper. Not lady. Miss Susan. He stared at it longer than he meant to, then walked away without saying a word. That night, he sat in his study long after the boys went to bed. The lights were off. Just the glow from the streetlight outside, bleeding through the blinds. He could hear the quiet creak of the house settling. Old wood, old memories. And somewhere down the hall, her footsteps, light, unhurried. She was checking the locks, maybe turning off the kitchen light, maybe peeking in on the boys one last time. He imagined her hand on their blankets, tucking them in, whispering something only they would hear. He closed his eyes and saw Eleanor, not in pain, not in fire, but holding the twins, whispering promises they were too young to understand. He opened his eyes quickly. He didn't want to go there, but now he was already there. The next morning, Susan walked past him in the hallway. They made eye contact. Just for a second, she gave a small nod and said, "Good morning, Mr. Oliver." No smile, no apology, no attempt to pretend like nothing had happened. And he said nothing, just watched her walk away, noticing for the first time how quiet the house used to be when she wasn't in it. The boys had started speaking more. Not a lot. Not to him, but to her. James noticed it in pieces, in the way breakfast didn't sit in silence anymore, in how Spencer asked for "more juice, please," without being told to use his words, in how Owen started humming to himself while brushing his teeth. Little things, but they mattered, especially in a house that had forgotten how to be alive. It was late afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Susan had set out crayons and pancake mix in the kitchen, an odd combination, but somehow it made sense with her. Owen sat at the table, tongue between his teeth as he drew a red sun with no sky. Spencer leaned against the counter, watching Susan stir the batter. James stood just outside the doorway. He wasn't trying to spy. He just didn't want to interrupt. "You stir gently, like this," Susan said, turning the bowl in slow circles. "Not fast, or it spills." Spencer nodded, serious, then mimicked her hands. "You got it," she said softly, with that voice, the kind that didn't rush, didn't judge. James leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a second. It felt good, the sound of her voice. Not because it was perfect, because it was steady. Then it happened. Something small, barely a moment. But it cracked something open. Spencer reached for Susan's hand as she helped him scrape the bowl. His little fingers wrapped around her thumb, and without looking up, he said, "Thank you, Papa." The word hung in the air like it didn't know where to land. Susan froze. Owen looked up. James stepped into the room without meaning to. Spencer blinked and looked around like he realized he'd said something wrong. James met Susan's eyes. She didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't rush to cover it. Just let it be, because there was nothing to fix, only something to feel. James knelt slowly beside Spencer. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't want to scare him, didn't want to make it a moment too big for a little boy. But Spencer looked at him with wide, unsure eyes. So James gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Spencer blinked fast, then leaned forward, not with words, but with trust, and rested his head against James's chest. It wasn't long, just a few seconds, but James felt it. The weight, the warmth, the wall between them, loosening. Later, after Susan tucked the boys in, James stood outside their room, hands in his pockets, back straight, like a man too tired to sit, but too unsure to move. She came out slowly. The hallway light was soft. Everything about her seemed softer in it. "I didn't tell him to call you that," she said quietly. "I know." James's voice was steady, but his eyes, not so much. She nodded once. Didn't say more. Didn't defend herself. That was what made it harder. She wasn't trying to earn anything. She was just doing what needed to be done, and doing it with love. He cleared his throat. "I haven't heard that word in years," he said. "Not from them." Susan's eyes filled. Not tears that fell, just the kind that made everything feel heavier. "I didn't know they remembered," he added. "They do," she said softly. "Maybe not everything, but they remember who they were, before." James swallowed hard. "And you?" he asked. She looked confused. "What about me?" she said. He paused. "You make them feel safe. And I haven't. I haven't done that in a long time." Susan shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Oliver, they look for you, all the time, even when you don't see it." He didn't respond. Not right away. He just let the words settle, like maybe they belonged to a truth he'd been afraid to face. That night, he didn't go to his study. He didn't turn on the news. He didn't open his laptop. He walked to the boys' room, and he sat beside their beds. Both of them were asleep. Spencer stirred once, mumbled something. James reached down and pulled the blanket up over his shoulder. Then he stayed, just for a while, long enough to hear them breathe, long enough to remember he was still their father, even if it had taken him this long to come back to them. James didn't ask for help easily, but somewhere along the way, he'd been told that grief came with steps, that healing had to follow a plan, that children needed professionals, not love alone. So he made the call, booked the evaluation, told himself it was the right thing to do. The twins deserved support, structure, progress, not just quiet smiles and crayon drawings taped to the wall. Still, the morning the therapist arrived, James stood in the entryway and felt something in his chest resist. The woman's name was Dr. Fletcher. Straight posture, firm handshake, clipboard in one hand, bag in the other. She was polite, trained, efficient. She greeted the boys with a soft smile, then glanced at Susan, measured, neutral. Susan wiped her hands on a kitchen towel. She stepped back without a word. She didn't need to be told where the line was. The boys sat stiffly at the table, their shoulders straightened, their eyes wide. James noticed it right away. The light that had slowly returned to them dimmed. Dr. Fletcher opened her notes, asked questions, one by one. "What sound does a cow make? Can you point to the triangle? If someone takes your toy, what do you say?" The boys answered, but not with the spark Susan had drawn out of them. Not with laughter, not with trust, just quiet voices. One-word replies, eyes flicking sideways to each other, unsure. James stood behind them, arms crossed, watching, waiting. He didn't know what he was hoping for. Approval? Proof? Something that could say, "You're doing fine, they're okay." After 30 minutes, Dr. Fletcher closed her folder. "They're cooperative," she said. Her voice was calm, clinical. "They've retained basic cognitive functions, but there are emotional delays." James nodded slowly. "What kind of delays?" She looked down at her paper. "They've formed an emotional bond with their caretaker." A quick glance toward Susan. which can be comforting in the short term, but it's important not to confuse emotional compensation with true progress. James blinked. Sorry, what does that mean? It means, she said carefully, their connection to the housekeeper may give the appearance of improvement, but long-term emotional development comes from stable, appropriate sources. James looked at Susan. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She just stood there, still holding the towel, as if waiting to be dismissed. After the therapist left, the house was quiet again. Not like before, but something colder. James sat at the kitchen table. Susan was clearing plates. The boys had gone upstairs. No songs, no dancing, just heavy footsteps and closed doors. He spoke before he meant to. You gave me false hope. It came out flat. Wounded. Sharper than it should have been. Susan paused, her back still to him. I didn't promise anything, she said softly. No, but you let me believe it, he said. Susan turned. Her face wasn't angry. It wasn't even hurt. Just tired. I wasn't trying to be anyone, she said. I just wanted them to smile again. James looked away, ran a hand across his mouth, tried to swallow the guilt building in his throat. I don't know how to do this, he said. I know, she replied. 3 words. No judgment. No accusation. Just truth. That evening, the boys sat on the floor with a box of crayons. But they didn't draw. Spencer rested his head on Owen's shoulder. Owen held his hand without a word. Susan stayed in the corner, folding clean clothes. Her face was calm, but her hands moved slower than usual. James stood in the doorway, watching the scene like he had no place in it. He'd asked for answers, asked for structure, and now everything felt less certain than before. Later, when the house had gone still, James walked to his study. He opened the drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a single envelope. No stamp, no address. Just a letter he once wrote, never sent. To Eleanor. He unfolded it slowly, the handwriting shakier than he remembered. I don't know how to be both mother and father. I don't even know how to be present. I try, but it doesn't feel like enough. I don't know what they need from me, and I'm afraid to ask. Because what if they need what I can't give? He closed the letter, sat back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt the tears come. Quiet, unforced. Not because of what was broken, but because of what might still be possible. The next morning, she didn't hum. Susan moved through the kitchen like a shadow, careful, quiet, doing only what needed to be done. No music, no singing while folding napkins, no silly voices for the boys' toast. Just silence. James felt it before he saw it. It wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was emptier, like someone had taken the sun out of the room. Owen and Spencer sat at the table, their cereal bowls half full. They didn't argue over spoons. They didn't ask Susan to sit beside them. They just ate, or at least tried to. Owen dropped his spoon twice. Spencer didn't speak at all. James stood by the fridge, pretending to look for something, but he was really watching, and feeling it, the slow undoing of whatever peace they'd started to build. He tried to talk to her once that afternoon. She was wiping down the counters, her sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back. She didn't look up when he stepped into the room. Susan, he said. She paused, but didn't turn. I didn't mean what I said, he added. She kept wiping the counter in slow, even circles. I know, she said. He waited. But that was all she gave him. No anger, no forgiveness, just the truth. She knew. And still, she was different now. The boys noticed too. That evening, Owen stood by the bottom of the stairs. He peeked around the corner, whispering, Miss Susan? She was in the laundry room, folding towels. She looked up, smiled softly, not with her mouth, with her eyes, but didn't come out, didn't kneel, didn't scoop him up like before. She just said, bed soon, sweetheart. And that was it. Owen nodded, turned away slowly. Spencer watched from the top step. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, small arms wrapped around his knees, like he was waiting for something that didn't come. James sat at the edge of his bed that night. The room felt bigger again. Not louder, just larger, like the silence had stretched across the walls. He glanced toward the dresser. Still dusted. Still untouched. He reached for the letter again. Read the last line twice. I'm trying, Elle, but I don't know what it looks like to let go of fear and still stay close. He folded it slowly, got up, and walked down the hall. Outside Susan's door, he stood for a while. No plan. No speech. Just the weight of everything he hadn't said. He slid the letter under her door, gently, without knocking, then walked away. The next morning, there was no reply. No mention of the letter. But something shifted. Not all at once. Not fully. But it was there. Susan set the table with a small glass of orange juice. With a paper straw bent just how Spencer liked it. She folded the napkins into triangles again. Not animals. Not funny shapes. But folded. Neat. Present. James saw it. And so did the boys. After breakfast, Owen tugged at her sleeve. "Will you come read to us later?" he asked. Susan looked at him for a moment, then glanced at James. James didn't speak, didn't give permission, just held her gaze, and nodded. She turned back to Owen and said, "If you get your socks on the right feet this time." "Yes." Owen grinned. Spencer laughed. And just like that, something returned to the air. Not joy, not yet, but possibility. That evening, James walked past the living room. The boys were curled beside Susan on the couch. She held the book open, pointing slowly at the pictures, her voice steady, warm. Spencer was mouthing the words with her. Owen was resting his cheek against her shoulder. James stood in the hallway. Not hiding, just watching. And, for the first time since the therapist's visit, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own home. Later, when the lights were low and the house was winding down, James stood at the kitchen sink. Susan stepped in, holding 2 small pajamas folded in her arms. They made eye contact. She placed the clothes on the counter. Didn't speak. James swallowed hard. "Did you read it?" he asked. She nodded. "I didn't know how else to say it," he added. Her voice came soft. "You didn't need to." She turned to leave, then paused. "I'm not trying to be her," she said. James looked down. "I know. I'm just here," she said. "That's all I've been trying to do." He nodded once, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Small, but real. It was a Saturday, the kind where the sky stays grey and time moves slow. The kind where silence doesn't feel peaceful, just heavy. James sat in his study, papers spread in front of him, but he hadn't read a single line. The house had been quiet all morning, too quiet, and somehow that silence felt louder than noise. He stared at the frame on his desk, a photo of Eleanor taken months before the fire. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at the boys. That smile, that light in her eyes. He remembered thinking she was the kind of mother who could make a room feel safe without saying a word. And now, there were days when he couldn't even walk into the nursery she'd designed, days when her absence was so loud it filled the air. Then it happened. A sound, faint, distant but unmistakable. Music, not the kind that played from the radio. This was laughter behind it. Footsteps, a child's squeal. He stood slowly, left the papers on his desk, walked down the hall, and as he got closer, he heard it clearly. Dancing music, bouncing off the walls, coming from the living room. He stopped at the doorway. What he saw made his breath catch. The boys were twirling in circles, Owen clumsily, Spencer with his arms stretched like wings. Susan stood in the middle, holding her phone as music played through the small speaker beside her. She wasn't doing it for show. She wasn't even aware he was watching. She laughed as Owen bumped into her, held Spencer's hand when he stumbled. Her hair had fallen loose from its tie, framing her face like she'd forgotten about everything else. It was a moment no one had planned, and it was beautiful. But James couldn't move, because it felt like too much and not enough all at once. He stepped into the room. The music didn't stop. Susan turned. Surprise flickered across her face. She reached to lower the volume, but before she could, "Papa!" Owen ran toward him, held his hand, and then something James didn't expect. The boy looked up and signed a word. "Dance." James froze. He looked at Spencer, who was now signing too, both hands moving with careful, hopeful precision. "Dance, Papa." James didn't know what to say. He hadn't taught them that. He hadn't even known they remembered the sign for it. Then Susan spoke, barely above a whisper. "They've been teaching me." James turned to her. "What?" She looked down, then back at him. Her voice steady, gentle. "They asked me to learn, said they wanted to talk to you in the way you used to talk to them." He couldn't speak. Not because he was angry, not even because he was hurt, but because something inside him cracked. And it was the sound of guilt. Of all the nights he stayed in his office, all the dinners he ate alone, all the mornings he left before the boys woke up. And still, they were reaching for him. Even now, even after everything. James dropped to one knee, held Owen's hand, tried to steady his voice. You remembered?" Owen nodded. "Miss Susan helped," he said. Spencer leaned in, whispering something in Susan's ear. She smiled softly, then looked at James. "They think you forgot," she said. James blinked. "What?" Spencer stepped forward. He signed again, not just a word this time. "You don't sign back anymore. Do you still love us?" The room fell still. James's breath caught in his throat. Tears rushed to his eyes, fast and full, but he didn't wipe them away. He shook his head, reached for both boys, pulled them close. "I never stopped," he whispered. "I just didn't know how to come back." The boys didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just held him. Small arms wrapped tight around his shoulders. Forgiveness pressed into his chest. Susan stepped back quietly. She didn't want to interrupt. This wasn't her moment. But James looked up, and for the first time, he didn't see her as the housekeeper, or the woman who had accidentally stepped into his life. He saw her as the one who stood in the gap, the one who stayed, the one who taught his sons how to reach for him again. The music was still playing, soft now, barely there, but in that room, with a man on his knees and two boys clinging to his shirt, it felt like a hymn, not the kind sung in church, but the kind heaven sends, when something broken finally begins to heal. The house was quiet again, not heavy, not broken, just quiet, like everyone inside was breathing slower. After the music, after the dance, after the signing and the tears, James had nothing left to say. But there was something he still needed to do. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Spencer, with his hand still wrapped around the edge of James's sleeve, James walked into his study. The letter was still there, the one he'd folded and put away, the one he'd written in the early months, back when the grief was so thick it felt like air couldn't move through it. He hadn't read it since then. He didn't need to. He remembered every word. He sat at the desk, unfolded it once more, and stared at the last lines. "I'm not enough without you. I don't know how to fill your place, Elle. And maybe I was never supposed to." His hand trembled a little as he refolded the paper. It felt like handing over something sacred, something no one else was ever supposed to see. But he walked down the hall, stopped outside Susan's door, paused. Then, slowly, he placed the letter at the foot of the door. No note, no explanation, just the truth left gently where she'd find it. He walked away without waiting. He couldn't sleep, not because he was restless, but because something in him was finally still, and it scared him. He wasn't used to stillness. He had lived in motion, meetings, orders, numbers. Grief had been his way of keeping busy. But now there was nothing left to run from, only what was right in front of him. And maybe who was right in front of him, too. Susan didn't mention the letter the next morning. She moved through the kitchen like she always did, calm, measured. The boys sat at the table, drawing pictures with their toast crusts, and James poured his own coffee, something he hadn't done in years. There was a small shift in the way they all shared the room now. Not louder, just closer, and that was enough. Later that day, when the boys were in the backyard chasing a paper airplane Susan had folded from yesterday's mail, James found her in the laundry room. She was folding towels, slow and steady. He leaned against the door frame, hands in his pockets. She looked up just once, then back at the fabric in her hands. "I read it," she said softly. He nodded. He didn't know what to say. Didn't come expecting a response. But then she set the towel down, turned toward him. "You don't owe me anything," she said. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't guarded. It was honest and gentle. "But I needed you to see them again," she added. "The way they really are." James looked at the floor. "They didn't stop needing me," he said. "I just stopped believing I could be who they needed." Susan's eyes didn't leave his face. "But they waited for you," she said. "They never stopped waiting." He blinked, fast, looked away. "I thought I was holding them back," he whispered. "No," she said. "You were hurting." Silence sat between them for a moment. Not awkward, not cold, just real. Then she stepped closer. Not too close. She placed the folded letter back on the table, the same one he'd left by her door. She didn't hand it to him. She just looked at him with something in her eyes that said, "I saw you. I still do." And that was more than any reply could have been. That night, after dinner, James found the boys on the floor of the living room, surrounded by puzzles and mismatched socks. Susan sat cross-legged beside them, letting Spencer place stickers on her arm without protest. Owen looked up. "Are you going to sit with us, Papa?" James didn't hesitate. He dropped to the floor without fixing his tie, without checking his phone, without needing a reason. He sat between his sons, one hand resting gently on each of their backs. They leaned into him like they'd been waiting all day, maybe all year. Susan didn't say anything. She just kept helping Spencer peel stickers, and in that moment there were no labels, no walls, no fear, just a man trying, two boys believing, and a woman who had never asked for anything, but gave everything anyway. Spring had finally settled in, the kind of morning where the air felt soft, where windows could stay open and nothing had to be said to feel peace. James stood by the back door, coffee in hand, watching as Susan set up a makeshift obstacle course in the yard. Just cones and ribbons. 2 hula hoops. 1 jump rope stretched between lawn chairs. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for children to run, to fall, to laugh. Owen darted between cones, arms flailing. Spencer was crouched at the start line, waiting for his cue. Susan clapped her hands once, smiling. "All right, little man. Ready, set, go." Spencer took off, legs wobbling, eyes wide. James smiled without meaning to. He couldn't remember the last time the boys had played outside like this. Not like this, not without someone pushing them, not without trying to make it feel normal. This was different. This was themselves. He stayed at the edge of the porch, just far enough not to disturb it. He didn't want to change the moment. Didn't want to bring his shadow into their light. But as he sipped his coffee, Owen turned and spotted him. The boy grinned, breathless, hair sticking to his forehead. He didn't shout, didn't call for help. He simply stopped where he was, raised both hands, and signed one small phrase. "Come, Papa." James froze. He saw Susan turn, saw her glance toward him, but she didn't speak. She didn't wave him over. She just stood back and waited to see what he would do. James looked down at his shoes. Polished, businesslike, still part of the man who had once used work to hide. He set the coffee mug on the porch rail. Then he stepped down. One foot, then the other. The grass was soft beneath him, cool, real, and the closer he got to the boys, the more he realized he didn't need to say anything. He didn't need a plan. He just needed to be there. Spencer clapped when he reached them. Owen tugged at his hand. James followed their lead through the ribbons, crawled under the rope, tripped over a cone. The boys shrieked with laughter. He laughed, too. Not forced, not polite, but from someplace deep, a place that hadn't made a sound in years. He didn't care about the grass stains, didn't care that he looked foolish. He just knelt there, in the middle of it all, and opened his arms. The boys ran to him, full speed, no hesitation. They tackled him to the ground, arms wrapped around his chest, faces buried in his shirt. And for a long moment, they didn't move. They just held on, like they'd been waiting for this moment their whole lives. And maybe they had. From the edge of the yard, Susan watched, one hand pressed over her chest, eyes full, not with sadness, but with something softer, a kind of reverence. She didn't interrupt, didn't approach. She knew what this was. This was a man choosing to come back. Later, James sat with the boys beneath the tree at the far end of the yard. Their legs were tangled with his. Spencer had a stick in his hand, drawing lines in the dirt. Owen leaned against James's side, thumb in his mouth. James glanced toward the house. Susan was gathering the cones. Still quiet, still careful, but different now. There was no distance in her movements, no silence between them that needed to be fixed. Just space. Shared. Peacefully. He didn't speak to her until the sun was lower in the sky. They stood on the back porch, watching the boys roll a toy truck down the steps. "Thank you," James said. Susan looked over. "For what?" He took a breath. "For not leaving when it got hard." She shrugged a little. "I thought about it." He nodded. "Yeah, I would have understood. But I couldn't," she said. "Not when I saw what they needed." James looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, he saw how tired she was. Not exhausted, not worn down, but poured out. For them, for him. And she had never once asked for anything in return. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. There was too much to say, and none of it felt big enough. So he didn't offer promises, didn't offer praise. He just stood beside her, watching his sons, alive, laughing, whole. And in that stillness, something passed between them. Not a question, not an answer, just understanding. The sky was soft, a pale blue, stretched wide and open above the backyard. No wind, no rush, just stillness. The kind of day where nothing needed to be said, where presence alone was enough. A picnic blanket was spread beneath the tree. Old, faded. Eleanor had picked it once long before the fire, back when weekends still held laughter and grass stains. Now, it lay beneath 4 people. Not a perfect family, but a whole one. Owen wore a cape made from a dish towel. Spencer clutched a plastic spoon like it was treasure. They were playing some game they'd made up. Half pirate, half explorer, all noise and movement and light. Susan sat cross-legged on the blanket, a paper plate balanced in her lap. She didn't say much, just smiled when the boys shouted, or leaned back when they nearly tripped over her foot. She'd learned how to make space for them, not just physically, but in the way that mattered most. James sat nearby, one knee bent, one arm resting over it. He held a cup of lemonade. It was warm now, but he didn't care. He was watching. Not as an outsider, not from a hallway, not through a cracked door. He was here, right in the middle of it. And for once, he wasn't thinking about what was lost. He was watching what had been found. At one point, Spencer fell. Nothing serious, just a scrape. But before anyone could react, he looked at Susan and called out, "Mama Susan." The words came easy, like they'd been living in his mouth for a while. waiting for the right moment to come out. Susan froze. Owen looked at his brother, then repeated it, louder this time. "Mama Susan." They ran to her. She caught them both in her arms, laughing through the tears that had already filled her eyes. James didn't move. He just watched. Something in his chest ached, not with pain, with release. Later, when the boys had drifted into quiet, their heads resting on the blanket, legs tangled together, James leaned toward Susan. She was sitting, with her hands folded in her lap, still and thoughtful. "I see her in them," he said. "Not in their pain anymore, in their joy." Susan looked over. Her eyes were full, but she didn't cry. "They were never lost," she said. "They just needed someone to remind them they were still allowed to be happy." James swallowed hard. "I thought love meant holding on, trying to preserve what was. But maybe it's letting go of what you expected, and choosing what's here." Susan nodded once. "You brought them back to me," he said quietly. She shook her head. "They were always here," she whispered. "You just had to see them." The sun had begun to lower. Shadows stretched across the grass, soft and gold and long. The boys were asleep now, arms over their eyes, faces slack with trust. James laid back beside them, closed his eyes for a moment. Susan leaned beside him. Not too close, but not far. There were no more big words to say, no apologies to give, no plans to make. Just this: a man, 2 children, and a woman who had no idea what she'd stepped into when she walked into that house for the first time, and yet stayed anyway. As the breeze moved gently through the leaves above, James reached out and laid his hand on Spencer's back. Spencer stirred, but didn't wake. He just exhaled, turned toward his father, and smiled in his sleep. And in that quiet, there was no pain left, only love, reshaped. Not the same as before, but still true, still real, still enough.